members. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to turn the videos on to welcome our guest today. I'm very excited to have Jessie Montgomery, one of our composers that we'll be working with in the spring. We've met Carlos Simon, we've met Daniel Bernard Romain, and today we're meeting Jessie Montgomery. She has just started teaching at the New School at the Mannes School of Music. And she's a recipient of the Leonard Bernstein Award from the ASCAP Foundation, Sphinx Medal of Excellence. And she is being commissioned by everybody, basically. The New York Philharmonic's Music 19 project, but Los Angeles Philharmonic has just performed her banner with the Sound and Stage series, which I'll send a link to that. That's been really a wonderful series. She's also started her career as a really wonderful violinist. And for those of you who might remember, in 2016, when the Sphinx Virtuosi came to Cornell as part of the Cornell Concert Series, they featured the Catalyst Quartet that Jessie was playing in, and also Jessie was playing in the Sphinx Virtuosi at that point. And the chamber orchestra at Cornell was lucky enough to get a coaching from the members of the Sphinx Virtuosi. So many of us attended that concert. But we had no idea we had such a great composer in the orchestra that we were observing. We are so lucky to have her because she is basically wanted by every single orchestra in the land right now. And so I want to welcome her, and we really appreciate you making the time for us and speaking to us. I sort of painted a picture of where we are in our discussion with the 12 speakers. And so we're really, really excited to engage with you with lots of questions and really great conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. I'm glad to be here and have a chance to engage with you guys. And, I saw that you already have a lot of questions. So I'm really look forward to diving into these things with you.
Yeah. So why don't we start with there's quite a bit of question on your training and your background, starting from your life as an instrumentalist, as a violinist, and then transitioning into composer. And so let me go to a question from Mary. You grew up in a unique art community, family, neighborhood, and access to incredible teachers. What are some elements of music that you think are important for musicians that aren't typically taught, especially to young students? For example, most young musicians don't get to experiment with improvisation, and it isn't a stressed aspect of classical music. But she learned it was something you were able to play with a very young age. So tell us about that aspect of improvisation, the family background, and the training that you've had.
Sure thing, sure. So I grew up in New York City, and in New York we have a lot of great opportunities and educational institutions, and I started out playing Suzuki violin when I was 4, and did group classes and private lessons, etc. But I was very lucky to also have a private teacher. Her name is Alice Knack. She's actually she lived in Rochester, and she's an incredible pedagogue, and especially when dealing with young beginner students. And she, at the time that I was her student, I started with her. She was also developing her own method called the Creative Ability Development Method. She has a series of books on it, and she was coined Mozart's mother by Mr. Suzuki, because she studied with him towards the end of his life and sort of beginning of her career. Because she's just so talented at working with kids and sort of translating that sort of philosophy of teaching like music as if it's a mother tongue that you're teaching it, and it's about repetition, and it's about like playing with the student and having the student play back with you and these kinds of things. And so um, she developed her method very much based on the Suzuki method and some of those practices. So creative ability development is about students learning how to improvise and how to be their own creative music. And so it was like a really great way for us to have more of a social element to our training, and then also be doing this really creative work as kids. And so the idea of like being a musician and like having like being creative in your own music making as a kid, that was like something that was like trained into me, essentially. And I was very fortunate to have had that experience. And it segued into me starting to compose when I was like in junior high school. I think was when I started composing, and that was when she left the school, and I went on to start composing and playing, doing all of my other bigger playing, like chamber music and orchestra and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, in my opinion about like early musical development, I really think that teaching kids how to be their own, use their own creativity in the music. I mean, I think that's what saved me, to be honest with you, when I was going through my conservatory training at Juilliard, which was very rigorous, and the environment was like so different from what I was used to. And being from New York and then going to school in New York with a bunch of like international students and students from, all over the country who were like very different from me. I felt weirdly out of place, even though I was like in my own city and doing my own thing most of the time. Knowing that I had that experience and knowing that I had like spent some time developing a voice for myself in some respect, even though I was really little when I was doing it, sort of like helped remind me and ground me when things got hard at school. And so and knowing that I had, so I could trust my own musicality, was really, I think, a really important foundation to have. Because I saw a lot of students struggle through conservatory. They felt sort of like disembodied, I think, from the experience of studying so rigorously and being far away from home and all the other things that are hard about being in college, and especially in that kind of an environment. But and not to mention, I mean, a lot of composers right now are writing pieces that involve open sections and improvisation and being, kind of wanting the players to bring in their own voice and their own creativity into the process. I just think that's a direction that we're clearly moving in. And so, developing that skill of being able to like take a motive, play with it on your own, in any way, you decide what those parameters are. You sort of learn like some typical ways to like do different kinds of figuration and patterns with a certain motive, like those kinds of like practices are things that just are going to they show up in a lot of pieces. And it's fun. It's fun way to spend time in your practice. When I was like with my teacher, Alice, we had our assignments at home were to practice our repertoire, to perform our repertoire, because practice and performing are two different things. Not just playing through your piece, but practice, perform, and then improvisation practice. So we had, so we were doing that regularly. And I play in a couple of ensemble situations where I'm asked to, where I improvise and sort of create stuff with my other partners. And anyhow, so I try to stay in regular practice of my improv work as well, which
So
keeps changing.
let me just kind of attach onto that tail piece about improvisation. So Angeliki, who's one of our flutists, has asked, growing up with a dad who's a Latin jazz percussionist, she was exposed to and always fascinated by improvisation and other jazz elements, but never learned how to do them while taking flute lessons. do you think a shift may be possible in the near future for new musicians to start learning a broader range of techniques instead of just classical ones? So I think she's asking, are there ways where our musicians in the Cornell Symphony and orchestras can practice improvisation? What are some of the ways they could work on that, for example?
Yes. Well, I mean, it depends on like what your goal is. If your goal is specifically to learn how to be a jazz improviser, that's a very specific lineage and style and technique involved in sort of like how you think about how to play over changes. And it's actually a very, very rigorous and specific kind of thing, right? Jazz, people sometimes think it's like, oh, like jazz is like this, free for all kind of thing. And it's
Right. So,
really,
I mean, I think
yeah,
Cornell has a wonderful jazz program, and Paul Merrill,
yes,
who's our jazz teacher, he teaches jazz and improvisation course. So I think we have resources that way. But I think
great,
that so if I could sort of kind of take over Angelique's
sure,
question.
sure.
So we're going to tackle some pieces in the spring and maybe later this semester, like Fred Jeffsky's Les Moutons de Panurge, where there's a set of rules, right? He set up a 65 note melody that you play 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. Or Terry Riley's in C, where there's a certain sort of, it's like a playground rules, right?
Right,
But
exactly.
using this set of rules, the members make decisions about how to fill that sound space. So,
Yep,
and that requires a whole set of decision-making process of how to listen to each other, what listening to and responding to what other person is doing in the ensemble. So, I mean, I'm interested in sort of creating that vocabulary and gesture in our students.
yeah,
Um,
great. Yeah, I actually, in fact, I mean, one thing to definitely look at is Alice's book. She has a string quartet, improvising for string quartets book. It's called, I think, just you look up Alice Knack, improvising for string quartets, or creative ability development string quartets. That book has a lot of great games. Some of them are geared, they're sort of graded for level, and so some of the language may seem like it's for youngsters, but then it can very, very easily be translated for,
mhm.
you can read it and also sort of absorb it as a sophisticated adult,
Yeah.
as well, because it is like you're saying, Chris, it's based on these these parameters. Like you set up parameters for how you're going to interact with each of the other players,
Mhm.
and it's really about setting up parameters. Like, okay, I'm going to be the top melody person. This person is going to sort of converse slash create the counter line with the top. The other person is going to create like an atmospheric texture underneath, and then the other person is going to like hold down the drone, or like the sort of harmonic underpinning, and then we're going to switch at some point, and there's like all of these, and it's really about sort of how you sort of move from one configuration to the next, and who moves first. And it's a lot of the way that I think about like improvisation, it's like it's structured, it's structured and free. Right, the structure has to be there in order to like know how to move from one place to the next.
Yeah.
um, I think actually, I don't know if you guys have you guys ever had public quartet at Cornell?
No.
I'm gonna just put a pitch out for
Okay.
them right now, if that's okay. And if you guys have some time to look up public quartet and get
Okay.
to know them as a string quartet,
Yep.
they actually give great improvisation workshops.
Okay.
And they're like, they're awesome. They're with CAG. They've been, a quartet. They've been in quartet since 2010. I was a founding member of that quartet early on, and they a lot of the work that they do is based on spontaneous, music making and improvisation,
Great.
And I think one of the first things to like think about is like when you think about the word improvisation, like what does that actually like bring up for you?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of actually one of the first, apparently, like when a jazz, well, when a musician is improvising, it's the same part of the brain is going off as is when you're saying your name.
Hmm.
um it's a very personal kind of, it's a very personal expression,
Yeah.
right? So I think, yeah, I that kind of, the work that we did in public quartet was a lot about, like I said, creating these structures so that you feel free to express whatever you want to express in that moment.
Hmm.
And that there's a lot of freedom within those parameters,
Yeah.
and sort of just remembering that there have to be some parameters in place for you to feel, to know sort of like how to express what you want to express.
Right.
That's very like general kind of like philosophy about it, but
But I think this. So Roger Mosley, who's at Chair, has written a book about play, and so it's about this idea of bringing about how children have this really natural uh, desire and ability to set up, a couple parameters, and they have a great time playing, right? But
Mhm, mhm.
somehow in classical music, we've sort of really kind of tempered that down, and because
Mhm.
if I have an 11-year-old and he's constantly wanting to just improvise rather than play his Suzuki book six
Right,
number that he's
right,
got to play next. But I
right,
think we all had that at one point as classical musicians. We all wanted to just kind of doodle and play and make things up.
right, right.
But then, unlike um, uh, students who are lucky enough to have Alice as their teacher, who encourages improvisation, we often encounter teachers who, really push method books and like structure for structure's sake rather than for play. So
Right,
I wish
right.
we would be freer to play more.
Yeah, yeah, freer to play more, exactly,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Which is
And
why
I
I
think,
love your piece Banner because it has all these moments where the players have to make decisions on their own. So I love that kind of piece. I haven't seen the score, but I assume that's what's going on in some of the portions.
well, actually, in Banner is completely
Oh, it's okay. All right.
composed through, which is interesting that it sounds like that's what's happening. There is a place where everyone's playing like a tune simultaneously.
Right. Right.
It
Because I
sounds,
figured
maybe it
that was
sounds
what was happening
improvised.
in my head because I hadn't had the
Okay.
score yet. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But there are other pieces. I have a string quartet called Breakaway that has totally improvised sections in this like second half of the, actually throughout. There's
Okay.
different places where there's improvisation sections, um, and like in those sections, I clearly write like, you know potential ideas for the players to work off of.
Okay.
Um, mhm,
All
mhm.
right, so I'm going to go to Laura's question next, who's manning the doors for us right now. In one of your interviews, you mentioned how to incorporate spontaneity and improvisation in your music, and that you have strong influence from European classical music. These two music styles are often thought to be in completely different worlds from each other and seldom found together. How have you, as a composer and performer, combined them and helped other performers to play music incorporating the two?
Mhm. Yeah, well, okay. I would just like to remind everyone that improvisation not not classical,
Right.
uh, because people, organists would improvise preludes during church services. There's the improvising cadenzas. The tradition of a composer writing a cadenza came in the Romantic era. Before that, it was a requirement that you play your own cadenza and that you memorize, you know the tune, you know all the material, and that you're able to show off your spontaneous musical skills. And not to mention the Baroque era. I mean, practically every figuration, every ornament is a form of free, interpretation. And so, um, So we just have to like keep reminding ourselves, like, okay,
Right.
that yeah, that when the problem is that improvisation became associated with jazz, and jazz became disassociated from classical music because it's black music versus white music, and
Mhm.
that's a whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And it just looked, jazz is looked historically has been looked down upon as a music that's less sophisticated because it's because of its origins.
Mhm.
And so when people say improvisation is not related to classical music, I think it's unfortunately this like relic of you know of a false belief, basically, that improvisation is part of a wild musical system. Um,
Mhm.
but so um, so I mean, I think I'm just, when I put loose, whatever you want to call it, improvised music or spontaneous music with through composed, I think, yeah, I'm just sort of playing around um, with that technique that's really been around for a long time,
Mhm.
and or forever. And I but I think, but for me, I think, like, in my own journey with it, I think, um, it's very much like, so I grew up, like I said, I grew up in New York. My dad ran a music studio. And so what that meant is there was 9 studios, there was a dance studio, there was a recording studio in there. And I was with him most days after school. My mom's an actress. And so she'd be away doing, working on a play. So I spent a lot of time with my dad. I spent a lot of time at the studio. Um, and I would hear all of these musicians, playing and jamming all day after school, all different kinds coming, swirling around all together at once. And I think the sort of like cacophony of that just sort of like is comforting to me. Like there's something um, weirdly like soothing about it. And so I find myself, and then at the same time, I was like doing this very, very straight, classical training on the violin, and like learning how to be like really like disciplined um, and honing my skills, whatever. And so I think that's sort of like in my music, I play around with that, like super, like, strict formal writing, and then all of a sudden it'll just like break apart into this other thing. And I actually like feel that way about how people interpret it. Like I really want people to stick with the stuff that's written down. And I hear, and sometimes people interpret it and also add stuff. I'm also like one of those violinists that was never into like and I'd hate, and I'm so sorry, I apologize for anyone here. I think as I'm getting older, I'm starting to get more like sentimental and like nostalgic. So I'm starting to like him more, but like the sort of Fritz Kreisler style of like, the extra slides and the like dippity doos and all that kind of stuff was never really like my thing. Um, Growing up, or just like ever, until recently I've been sort of like feeling a little like da 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 da. Yeah. But I anyhow, all that to say, like my written stuff, when it's not improvised, I actually like, I'm really pretty intent. I mean it to be sort of really formal in the way that it's interpreted, and then the other stuff to be in total contrast to that. Um,
So while we're talking about your compositional process, we have three students who are asking about your process, and one of them is asking, actually, two of them are asking, when you compose, are you thinking about a particular emotional experience, or do you follow a structure, sort of a compositional structure from beginning to end, or is it specific scenes or programmatic things that you're thinking about?
It depends on the piece. So for some pieces, I will have like there will be like a sort of narrative element. I do enjoy having some kind of narrative element, even if whether it's explicit or not, whether it ends up in the program notes or not, just to sort of help me, like help guide my sense of the form. Um, so like yeah, so I work a lot. I do work with sort of narrative ideas. I work with image ideas. um And yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, a piece is like about something, or based on a certain image, or story or point of view. So, like for example, I have chamber orchestra piece called "Records from a Vanishing City," which in itself has a very narrative kind of title. And that one is like kind of like a tone poem, like reflection on growing up in New York, actually, and sort of the relics of the past, and sort of the of the way the neighborhood used to be. It's no longer what it used to be at all. It's now more corporate and stuff like that. But I yeah, so that one like had a clear narrative, and it was like a based on a lullaby at the beginning, and then that lullaby sort of transforms into like a sort of elegy at the end, as a sort of remembrance. And um, and then like something like, for example, in my piece Breakaway, has it kind of darts all over the place, but like that piece, the first movement is called Lilting. It's literally based on one gesture, and it's not like necessarily based on like a deep kind of image. It's just based on this da, da, like this one gesture that goes down. And then there's another movement that's called Smoke, so it's like based on the image of smoke, and it's like, and then there's one that's like called Songbird, which is the viola has a solo throughout while the other players are playing like really against the viola, while he's playing like a really he or she. Well, in this performance, it's a he. The recording that's out there, he's playing like a really sort of like sing-songy melody, but that's like being sort of like smashed by the other players. And so there's like there's like some sort of like theatrical or narrative aspects to some pieces, and then but yeah, in terms of like the process of how I get to that place, that's also like can be random. That can be that's like a like, for example, okay, I just finished a piece called, and I couldn't title it. I didn't know what to title it because I wasn't really like inspired with the title, but and also the piece, I knew I was just trying to figure out, it's for a unique combination. It's for percussion, violin, and clarinet. And I knew, I was like, you know what, my main goal in this is to like figure out how the violin, the clarinet, and percussion are going to sound good together. So that was like what my focus was in that context. Didn't have any like kind of narrative aspect to it. So it's just different. It's different each time. I have a book of like my little composition notebook over here that like has all of my notes and like any kind of brainstorms. I spend a lot of time brainstorming and trying to come up with different just connections that I see, or and see if anything sort of like comes out of that feels inspiring. Yeah, but inspiration is extremely important. You can't write a piece of music without a point of like without a goal in mind, and without you can't just start writing it. It doesn't. I've tried that actually sometimes in like desperate deadline mode or something like that. But it just doesn't, it never turns out the way I want it if it doesn't have like a really specific aim. Yeah. Whether that's a narrative or whether that's just like a certain timbral aim. Desire.
Yeah, once a long time ago, I got some really bad advice from one of my mentors about composition. He told me that if you look at a piece of music and your reaction is sort of Mahler, like you want to change it to improve it, then you should be a composer. But if your reaction is, wow, I would have never come up with that in a million years, then you should be a conductor and advocate for the composer, right? But I think at that point in my training as a composer, I hadn't found my voice yet, right? So I think Carlos talked about this a little bit in terms of in his growth as a composer. until a certain point, he was just kind of copying different composers. And
Yep.
then once he found his voice, then it became a different kind of relationship, how he wrote music and how he drew inspiration. Because before it was sort of about trying to figure out a method of how to do certain things like Ravel or like Bartok or like Lutoslavsky. But
Mhm.
so when I was given this advice of which way to choose,
Mhm.
I had no idea what my voice was, whether I needed to have a voice.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk about a little bit about that? How important it is for composers to find their voice? Because especially, in the New York Times article, which we're gonna get to a little bit,
Mhm.
in the tagline is you just want to write like where you don't have to think
Or
about
whatever, right, yeah.
extra issues where like
Uh-huh.
every white composer can do without any problem, right? But
Mhm.
somehow as a minority composer, as a woman composer, there's all this baggage you have to heavy lift
Yeah.
top of
Mhm.
the very difficult process of writing music, right? You
Mhm.
got a
Mhm.
blank sheet of paper, and on top of that you got to do extra baggage lifting.
Right. Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. So, I mean, the finding one's voice, I would say as a composer, but and as a player, to be honest. One of the reasons that that I went back to composing was because I was playing in a string quartet, and I didn't feel like connected to the interpretive process. I didn't feel like I knew what I was saying when I was saying, "Oh, let's play this shorter," or "Let's play this longer," or "Let's phrase it this way," "Let's phrase it that way." I was just kind of, I mean, I was going on my instincts and which is enough up to a point, but then you get into these like arguments with your colleagues about, well, it should be this and it should be that, and it's like, well, should, like, what's the point of this process that we're even going through if it's so should, if it's like,
Mhm, mhm,
well, only one outcome that we should be doing.
right.
um then so then I wanted to sort of go, I realized that composing was important for me to like learn what's um learn more about the process of like actually, like, when you're creating music, are you putting it down like as a sort of finite thing that's like never going to change, or is it something that you hope then evolves with the players in some way? And I think for me it's the latter, and I would imagine that that's the case for most composers, because the music has to be has to live on, so, and it lives on through the work of performers and their interpretive abilities and curiosity about your music in order to even like continue to invest in it. And Yeah, and I think when it took a while for me to feel like, okay, I have something that's like mine in terms of like my voice, I guess. And um but that came, that has to come, that's like that comes only by doing. You have to keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and then you sort of like, and then land on something. um I I have had commissions where it's like, oh, can you write, you're a Black person, why don't you write a piece about such and such? And it's like, well, sometimes I want to write about Black stuff, and sometimes I want to write about like wind. I
Mhm,
literally have a piece called Caught by the Wind, which
mhm,
is about a branch that's mangled by wind.
mhm.
I used that imagery to sort of like, create this sort of like upwardly cast. What do you call something that cascades upward? Is that a thing?
Uh,
Anyway, like this sort of like like rising but layered, going
mhm,
upward kind of piece. It's like, and anyhow, but like, and I really like that piece, but people don't play, that one doesn't get played as often because it doesn't have to do with like multiculturalism and all the other kinds of things that some of my other pieces have something to do with.
mhm,
So so anyway, that's a whole other thing. But I mean, like, um, but I think, finding your voice is about writing or creating from a place of your own design, you know,
Mhm.
that where you're giving yourself the parameters, and that's the full expression of your voice, is when you're actually really engaged in all the steps that are involved in the creative process from conception to realization. And if that's not happening, then there's a block. Anytime I have a piece where I've been asked, where there's like a lot of parameters from the commissioning side, um, Banner was a miracle that piece, that I even wrote that piece, because I was not thrilled to have to. The way that it came to me was, oh, we want to celebrate the Star Spangled Banner, the 200th anniversary of Star Spangled Banner, which was not something that I ever would have thought to do for
Mm.
any reason. Because I have I don't. My parents, my dad, well, he didn't go to Vietnam. He avoided it, but my parents were involved in the civil rights movement, Vietnam anti-war work, and they never sat. I basically was taught not to stand for the Star Spangled Banner. I was brought up not to,
Mhm.
and so, um, as a form of protest, and I have, I, and that this is the argument of, like, what is patriotism, and da 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 da. I mean, um, I think we have a very, like, kind of narrow view of what patriotism means in this country. So, anyhow, I didn't want to write that piece, I'll be honest with you. And so I had to find my way to it, right? And find my voice in it. And so how you find your voice, it was a process of, like, okay, if I'm going to write this piece, if I'm going to, like, commemorate this, I want to show it in a way it, that sort of thwarts the idea that there's only one sort of American
Mhm.
way,
Right.
but that
Right.
there's a lot, that we're in this place together with, like, all these different cultures and all these different contributions. And Yeah, and so then, anyway, and then it ended up being like a piece of, there's 12. I got to go through and actually count, but I think the last time I counted, there's like at least 12 different anthems and tunes and things that get whirled around in that piece.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's an example of, and yeah. So finding your voice, it's like a thing. It's a process, I think the main thing to remember is that, if um, you have to find your way to. There's a point of connection in anything, in any project, or any subject, you
Mhm.
know. Um, so finding your sort of opinion and your point of view in that is a process that's worth going through.
Yeah.
Um, mhm.
I think for our students, they're approaching music as a from the viewpoint of a performer, and I
Yeah.
think it's really important for this conversation that I so enjoy between performer and composer, because uh, whether they're living or dead, because through the score, I find ways to uh, sort of toss the issue around. Right? Was this person really thinking about this? Right? And so when I meet with a living composer, I'm sort of in that sort of let's compare notes. Like this is what I came up with. Like, was this your idea? So
Hmm.
that's my most like that process for me is the most enlivening, engaging part of meeting a composer because I want to kind of pick their brain and figure out what they were thinking. Right. So
Right.
I think as performers. It's we live in an age where there's so much documentation in terms of YouTube and recordings where we hear a piece first without engaging with it on the score
Hmm.
as a first hand. And I think there was a bit of an advantage back in the day where all you had was a four-hand piano version of a Beethoven score, and that's how you
Right.
realize the piece. You play through it, and you struggle through the phrasing without hearing some other person's version of it, right?
Mhm,
So I think
mhm,
in this age where our students, they tend to, their first contact tends to be the YouTube video version,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And I think there's a danger of whatever that version is becomes the template,
mhm,
right? And I think it's important for our students have that, also take part in that creative process of going through and figuring out what decisions did the composer make, why did she choose this note and this rhythm and this harmony, and then go through that process and go through the same forks in the road with you. And then
mhm.
that's a real conversation they can have with you, right? And then,
Absolutely.
then when you're here for our performance, we sort of compare notes, right? So
Yeah, and I'll say like sometimes I get a question like I'll get a question from a player that's like, "Well, I heard the such and such recording, and they play it like this. Is that what you would prefer?" And for me, I like I always give a really vague answer to that question. I don't want to
right,
say, like, I
right,
want that person to come up with their own, like, okay. And I know I said a minute ago, I said, there's a certain strictness to the written stuff. What I mean is like, don't add stuff.
right,
Like, don't
right,
add glissandos or add like
yeah.
some people. This is the other thing that people do. They add jazzy licks to my pieces. Don't do that. Please don't do that. if they're not written in. If I haven't written a grace note, please do not add a grace note. It's actually really, I find it very disturbing. But what I mean is there's a flexibility in the phrasing and also in like, for example, all right, a young quartet called the, oh God, what are they called? Bolliger Quartet?
Mhm.
Bolliger.
Okay.
They just played my piece Strum, and there's a part in the end that I have marked Menomoso, and they really took it
Mm,
like exaggerated the Menomoso aspect of it, and it was shocking.
mm,
I mean, I've never played it that way. We just, we sort of did a little bit of a slight broadening of the tempo when we would play it. And that was like our group, that's Catalyst Quartet. We're like a bunch of like fiery, people. And we just were like, we're going to gun it to the end. That's our vibe. These guys took a really broad, like sort of singing thing, which was like shocking. But I loved that the information was there in order for them to have the right to do that. So I think when we think about interpreting scores, there's a certain way of interpreting those markings, like this idea that like, for example, like when we talk about Beethoven, right, and the sforzandos in a row, that it indicates a kind of crescendo, right? That's something that we learn about. In another interpretation, can it also mean that there's a timing thing that's happening also? I mean, if it takes, my thing about composing is the more black there is, that there's also somehow an indication of time in that, because it
mhm,
takes more time to put that ink on the page, and so
mhm,
therefore it has a little bit more resistance. I'm a big fan of really resistant sforzandos in Beethoven,
mhm,
like, so that actually time bends a little bit, just a little bit, like not in a way that you hear, but that you feel,
mhm,
not, um, anyway, so like, those kinds of, um, oh gosh, I'm like, I got lost in what were the point of what we were talking about. But I just, when it comes to interpreting, I think there's a lot of, that's the whole fun of being a performer and getting a score and sitting down with
absolutely.
it. I'll never forget. I recommend you guys do this. When I first started with Public Quartet, we didn't know what we were. We had just met. We two of us, two of them had been friends at Eastman, and then two of us, me and Amanda, had recently met, but like instantly became friends. And so um, we barely knew each other basically, and we were like, we want to play this, be like, try some stuff out and see what we get. We went to the Manus Library and we took the Webern Fünfsatz, 5 pieces for string quartet, And um, we learned it from scratch. We'd never heard it before. We were like, let's just do this, let's see what happens. It's like very challenging
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
for the string quartet, and also musically
Mm.
challenging. And we just like learned it from scratch. We hadn't ever heard it
Wow.
before. And we fell in love with it. I fell in love with it.
Mhm.
I didn't know I liked Webern as much as I did through
Mhm.
that process.
Yeah.
I was like enthralled by the thing. And we came up with an interpretation that was, we ended up going to the Juilliard quartet program at
Mhm.
the time. They have these residencies for programs, like quartet intensive programs. We went there, and the Joel Krosnick, Joel Krosnick goes, wow, you played that like it was beautiful.
Yeah.
It's like it was a song.
Yeah.
It's like there was a lyricism that we were bringing to it, because we were like seeing the lines in a different way, whatever. I don't know. Like we were, and it was because we didn't like have much other influence. I think at one point we started listening to a recording of Quartet Casals playing it.
Mhm.
Um, at one point in our process, but when we started out, we were really just like dealing with the notes and the rhythms and the interlocking, just trying to figure out how to put it together. And I think that was like one of the best experiences I've ever had in that setting.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach conductors, I'm always trying to give them a fishing rod rather than giving just one piece of fish, right? I want
Yeah.
them to know how to analyze a piece of score and then come to their own decision, right? So
Hmm.
if somebody comes to me, well, I made this decision because Rattle is doing it in that recording. It's like I don't want to hear that. No,
Yeah,
you do your homework and make a decision that's your own. You can call it your own. That's what part of being a musician is, right?
totally. Yeah, totally.
All right,
Yeah. And
let
it makes the performance more fun too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let me switch gears and dive into this New York Times article that
Okay.
our students have read. And we have like 9 questions from the
Oh,
students.
wow. Okay.
All right, so first one's from Alex Bonilla. Hi there. You brought up a serious concern in the New York Times article about how some organizations may only be diversifying their music in order to save face. As a Latino musician, I also worry about the prospect of being tokenized. What do you think? What do you think orchestras should do to stop minority musicians, composers from feeling this way? Is there anything that minority musicians, composers can do on our part? So, big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. Um, um, I think that organizations need to treat minority musicians the same way they treat non-minority musicians and composers, meaning like you have a genuine interest in their work
Yeah.
and you're inviting them to be a part of your organization, because not just because of their
Diversity.
background, but because of um, their unique ability, or voice, or what have you. In orchestras, it's a very, very, very different and challenging thing right now, because they're trying to figure out whether to do it. Has a lot to do with how the audition process goes. And, there's a big argument about whether the screened auditions should happen. I mean, but the problem is, the history of the screened auditions is that the screens went up in order to try to combat, biases.
Mhm.
But then the screen would come down in the
In the final.
finals,
Yeah.
and people would be turned away because of if they were Black or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, you know, um, I think, I really do think that organizations are people are, they're trying actually in a way that I'm surprised about, that I'm starting to, I have, I don't remember what I said in that article about, I think I might have said, I hope I used the word optimism, because I'm skeptical, but I'm also optimistic.
I think that's how you phrased it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you have to remain optimistic, and give people the benefit of the doubt. And also, this is a really huge learning curve as far as also getting to know who these artists are, because a lot of people are getting to know people for the first time, getting to know their work for the first time, and that process takes time. I've just started curating this year for the first time. I'm going to be
Mhm.
doing some curating over the next couple years, and it takes time to get to know a composer's work. You can't just like pluck it just because of they fit a box of some kind. You can get it really wrong. You can get your program totally wrong if you do it like that.
Yeah.
So I think that number one, I think it's important to be, I think one thing actually, I mean, I know you guys had AFA here last week, but getting to know organizations that have been doing this kind of work for a long time, and getting to know like how they navigate and who is in that network is really a useful way to engage with this work, with the work of diversity in the arts. And Sphinx is a kind of cornerstone organization for that. And their network is immense. And so many people have, and especially in the past several years, they have hosted a conference every year, and that has drawn industry people from all over the country. However, it's very interesting how, like, even with that, I hear people say a lot all the time, well, where are the musicians of color? Yeah. Anyway, Sphinx supports Black and Latinx musicians, primarily string players. Although their network includes like a whole slew of composers and singers and orchestral musicians and like, you know, people go to the conference and then they come back and they're like, well, I don't know, like who can we hire and stuff like that. And it's because there's another network in place in classical music that is called the administrative artistic planning tier. That's management, artistic planning committees, and things like that. Those are the people that we call gatekeepers, right? When we're talking about gatekeepers, there's this system in place where if you're not under certain management, you're not going to get a certain gig. Nobody knows about you if you're not under one of these umbrellas. And also they are people too, and they are also like full of biases, and they have, you know, in a lot of cases not done the work to know who the composers are and their music, not just their names, but their actual music and their, you know, that's one of the things that I get a little funny about is like with my own music. Yeah, I do have a few pieces that are like political in nature, like Banner, for example, and not necessarily political, but also like influenced by my African American identity. A piece called well, there's an orchestral piece called Soul Force. That was commissioned specifically, though, for an event that was to raise money for Eric Garner's family. And then I have another Source Code is a string quartet that's sort of inspired by Black spiritual. Anyway, but I mean, you know, so like to have those pieces be the main pieces that get performed because they sort of fit a certain like message that an organization is trying to make is like, okay, but what that does is it limits my voice in the world as well, and the sort of breadth of my work. And so that's tricky, and I'm figuring out how to navigate that. I luckily have been able to, I've built myself a little team of people, like in between my management and my distributor. I'm self-published, so I don't work with a publisher, but I have a distributor who helps, helps me work with orchestras and things like that. And, you know, so we sort of like can sort of push certain pieces. But anyway, so these artistic planning committees, you know, they have a limited view sort of like basically of like what's there, and like they have their own agenda about what it is that they're trying to do and how to serve the organization. And anyway, all of that stuff can get really cloudy, and it can prevent certain voices from coming through, because they're just simply not given the chance, because you know, a lot of concert halls and things don't want to deal with they want to deal with management. They want to deal with, names,
Right. Right.
So, um, anyway, so it's it didn't answer your question because I think it's an in process
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
And I think what one of the things that we can do is to if this is going to sound funny. If you see something, say something. If you
Yeah.
see that someone is um, being unfair or not considering, the full spectrum of what they can be considering, and
Hmm.
you observe them to have a limited view on
Yeah.
what's out there, or you happen to have a resource that you want to share. Um, it's important to speak up and mention it because you never. It's really, really you'd be surprised, especially right now. People are more receptive, and they're a
Hmm.
little bit more concerned,
Hmm.
being right and stuff like that. So it's a good moment to speak up because people are gonna they're like eager to like kind of make sure that they're sort of steering the ship in the right direction.
Hmm.
I've had a couple of really nice outcomes with that this summer where and I'm not a very for as bold of a statement as some of those things I said in that article. I'm not a very like, in your face kind of person, but in the few I can write a letter,
Hmm.
I can have a one-on-one conversation with somebody about something I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
Um, and so those are ways, and I've been very encouraged by a few of the exchanges that I've had and the results that have come from it just by speaking up.
Hmm.
So I think that's like your best tool. And also like just for your own interest and your own knowledge, like just getting to know more composers of color, if that's something that's interesting to you, like getting, doing some research on that. There's some great resources online. The what is it? The Rob
Yeah.
Deemer's
He'll be one of our guests later in the semester. Yeah.
research has been really helpful.
Hmm.
Yeah. And Also, Chamber of Music America has a great resource that they don't put out enough. I'm on the board. I should like make a whole. I'm gonna make a stick. See, that's the other thing. I'm on a couple of boards,
Yeah.
so I'm hoping that that's a place where I can also sort of like, speak up and
Hmm.
voice, concerns and things like that. But anyway, the CMA has another resource that's um, on their website that's all um, underrepresented composers. A whole list because they have to have that for their commissioning grants and stuff. So anyway,
I totally agree with you. I think one of the ways, um, it, I think most likely our students, as they finish Cornell, they go out into the world to their various professions. It's more likely that they'll be buying the box seat or the tickets to the symphony rather than playing on stage. Or they're serving as a volunteer board or actually being called upon to serve on a nonprofit board. So I think this idea of speaking up when they see something that is not equitable, something is not right. Um, your advice is absolutely true. They should, a letter from a subscriber, a letter from a board member is a powerful message to the arts administrators, right? So I
yeah,
think too many times, whatever the case might be, we somehow think, oh, no one will listen to my sort of little voice, or no one would care that I said something, or I talked to somebody. But I just had this
yeah,
example for our orchestra board where a couple of years ago, I had put in a request for a sound shield for the orchestra at Cornell. And the dean, who was in charge of Bailey Hall at the time, said, no, we don't have money for that. And then one of my students, who was a trumpet player, who was sitting right in front of the timpani, sent me an email, unbeknownst to him, that I was trying to get the sound shield. So he wrote an email to me saying, the timpani's right in my ear. Is there something you can do to buy a sound shield? So I said, okay, forward that email to the dean. And
yeah,
guess what? 24 hours later, my
yep,
request is approved. So in every way, however small you might think it is, however insignificant you might think that letter, that talking to somebody might be, when you speak up, it adds to the voices.
yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm going to go to Jonah's question.
Sure.
Uh, so Jonah's question is, the article makes note of the fact that a typical orchestral season is very antique, white, and male, all of which are true. Unfortunately, this is a demonstrative of the fact that orchestral audiences historically haven't been very receptive to change. I would argue with that. And I completely agree with your concern that the sudden rush to include Black composers may not last for more than a season or two for that reason. How can orchestras keep diversifying their repertoires in a way that's more sustainable and doesn't put so much immediate pressure on Black musicians?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, I mean, my answer is like sort of similar. I think it's about organizations um, committing to composers, like committing to them and engaging them in sort of various ways throughout the organization. There's so many ways to sort of be a part of a community, a part of of an organization,
Yeah.
and it's about. I also sort of am an advocate for. I'm an advocate for new music, and also the concept that new music is going to be the thing that saves classical music, because I think it needs the institution needs to evolve, right?
Yeah.
So, what better way to do that than to invite composers to engage with audiences in a few different ways, right? So I think one of the way a couple of different ways to look at it is like, um, what are the different ways to have a residency or to have a composer in residence, and to have a couple of composers in residence, so that you're a lot of the time they spend big money on soloists, right? And that's great because we don't want to not hear concertos. I want to hear concerto, but um, maybe some of those investments can go towards committing to the development of new work with composers,
Yeah.
and or having them engage with audiences or with their youth, with their education programs, um, and also donors, inviting artists, composers to engage with donors, I think is a really valuable potentially, and help people, when you put a face to somebody, then you feel like them, like you can
Yeah.
relate to them. And I think that we have an advantage in working with new music and with people who are like living composers to create that kind of a community again,
Mm-hmm.
around the music. Um, so I don't know. That's like one thing I would love to see happen.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's like internal work. It's like the idea that like, I mean, everybody has to sort of commit to their own like desire and interest in the work of a diverse palette of voices, and that you have to decide, like, do I actually want to hear from these voices? And then if the answer is no, then you're probably going to go you know off with the ship,
Mm-hmm.
in the other direction. Probably you're probably going to burn out with you're gonna get washed away.
Yeah.
But I do think if the answer to that question is yes, I am actually really curious and interested, and then just keep engaging with that question
Mm-hmm.
personally. Again, it's like everyone's it's the same thing as anything and any of this political stuff we're dealing with. It's our obligation to vote, to decide what matters to you, you know why it's important, like how you want to engage with others around that topic. It's like a very personal decision to
Mm-hmm.
become like not a jerk, and to become like anti-racist, and to question your own biases. And so I think, it's hard to say, like, and a lot of times people say, what do we do, and I think right now they're doing the thing of like, oh, let's get all the Black composers, and we can, and like, get them all, which is like a step, it's like a necessary step, I think. And it's awkward, but it's like, but then beyond that, it's like, then it's still like that personal, it's still like an individual process of like, okay, of the people that we just engaged, whose music am I going to sit with for like the next month and like decide, oh, should we be giving this person a full-time residency or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that part takes time. I think all of our expectations should be, we just have to keep them in check, in terms of, um, because it's a fine line between being like really passionate and like out there activist about it, and then also like realizing that there's a lot of like negotiating that has to go on, and a lot of like kind of slower work that has to go on as well.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, Aaron Flagg made the analogy of having a relationship with his teenage boy, right?
Mhm.
At the time, maybe I'm sharing too much, but he shared it, so I think we can share. At the
That's
time, his son was making lots of bad choices, and he was like, how do I fix this? And his father said, well, do you want to have a relationship with your son, right? A long-term relationship where you're going to be talking to each other 20, 30, 40 years from now, right? And uh, I think a lot of organizations are sort of in this like put out the fire mode, right?
Yep.
They say, okay, we gotta respond. So they
Yeah.
put up a statement that,
Mhm.
okay, well, it's not enough to just put up a statement, the BLM statement, right? So
Mhm.
what kind of institutional, structural changes are you going to make so that
Mhm.
these relationships that are born are not just one-offs, that it's
Yep.
not just we're going to play a few Black composers work and check our boxes,
Mhm.
but are you going to have a long-term relationship? So as you said, residencies where the composers are brought into the community and really get to know the donors, the musicians, the community. And I think so for too long, these major organizations, arts organization of a city, have really paid no attention to 50% or
Yeah.
60% of the city, like city of Philadelphia, right? If you're an orchestra in Philadelphia, you should cater to everybody, not just one portion of that city.
Philadelphia is a very, very segregated
Yeah.
town. That place is really, I mean, I know you guys we all have it, but Philadelphia is shockingly disparate. Um,
But I'm going to point to Ithaca.
yeah.
As I mentioned before the call began, Ithaca has 5 elementary schools, and they are. It's like we're stuck in the 1930s,
Mhm.
and so
Mhm.
and that there's so many mechanical logistics things of like real estate and
Yeah.
which part of the town has the good school and all of that. So
Yep.
all of that it comes to play in this equation of trying to solve this.
Yep.
Um, right? And so,
Mhm.
um, and I think orchestras um, have a chance actually to be a template for this dialogue to happen in a positive way, so that this dialogue can happen in a constructive, positive flow, and that can go out to the rest of society if they're going to be smart about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
But of course, we have to have representation in arts administration, in conductors,
Yes.
in artistic directors, not just musicians, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So that it's really
Yeah.
representative of our society.
I will say that another plug for Sphinx is that they have a new program that they started. It was like last year or the year before, called Sphinx Lead,
Mhm.
which is for young people who are wanting to go into arts administration,
Yeah.
and who have a vision for that. So if any of you would be eligible for that, I think that's something to just like get to know a little bit, and also just to learn about what those projects are, and if there's any way that you can help support those a lot of them are musicians already. Yeah, most of them have come from a musical background and are now going into, so learning about their organizations, and like, is there something that you know would like to do to help
Mhm.
them get off their feet or something like that, that's something also. But yeah, I agree. Yeah, the administrative level is really where it's at, because those are the people making decisions, and then and bringing a perspective that's fresh, and
Mhm.
more inclusive.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, your visit today is bookended by AFA last week. for Dworkin
Okay.
about the work of Sphinx. And next week we have Aaron Dworkin coming.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
So,
So you'll get all the Sphinx
yes.
talk then. Okay.
And in fact, I'll actually, we're going to wrap up in about a minute, but I'm going to
Okay.
throw out a challenge to our student membership. In January, they have a Sphinx Con or a Sphinx Connect where all these uh, administrators from the field come together for a 3-day conference. And there's actually a student conference, so that it's rather than $120, it's like $25. But of course, you got to fly there and
It's super fun.
yeah. But
A good
like
time.
if any of the orchestra members want to be part of that, I will look into finding a donor to fund that. So
And it's open to everyone. It's not just for
everyone,
Black and Latinx
yeah,
background folks. It's for everyone to just engage with that work and, see how you want to engage with that work. It's really,
absolutely.
really a great time. Yeah. And we have a lot of dance parties.
All right. So we didn't get to all the questions like usual, but I want to thank all the students who posted questions because I'm constantly humbled at your engagement with our speakers. And I'm sorry we can't get to all of your questions, but you are really asking great, great questions and engagement.
Excellent questions.
I'm going to ask everybody to put their videos on because we're going to take a group picture before we say bye to Jessie Montgomery. She's graciously agreed to stay on. I know some of you have to jump to a class in about a couple minutes. So we will stay on for another 15 minutes or so to answer any individual questions. But let me take a picture. I'll take 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. All right. Okay. So I'm going to stop recording. Thank you, Jessie.